All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Taryn Hochleitner. I'm the Director of Policy Insights at the Data Quality Campaign. We are thrilled to be hosting this webinar in partnership with the Strada Education Foundation. Today's conversation is all about improving state data systems. So we'll be exploring steps that states can take to make data available that can help them advance their education and workforce goals. We have a great lineup to dig into this topic. I'll be joined by John Furr, who's going to be offering an overview of Strada's Clear Outcomes Framework, which is a great resource for states looking to improve their data systems. Then we'll have a state panel featuring leaders from 2 states that are really leading the way on this work. So we have Matt Berry, who's the Executive Director of the Kentucky Center for Statistics, and Tammy Heiler, who's a Senior Advisor for K-12 and Early Childhood to Colorado Governor Jared Polis. As we go, we encourage you all to submit any questions you have for all of us via the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can by the end of the hour. But first, I want to ground us in a vision for what it could look like for states to reimagine their data systems to support data access. If you don't know DQC, we're a national advocacy organization, and we believe that leaders should be able to use data to drive systemic change, economic mobility, and student success. We've spent almost 20 years helping states develop policies that promote data use and collecting best practices from across the country. So we're bringing that perspective to today's conversation. So we all know that everyone's journey after high school is different. So you might be a high school student like Grace, who's planning to be the first in her family to go to college, or a CTE student like Lisa, who might want to opt for an apprenticeship after she graduates, a community college student like Joey, who's looking to transfer to a 4-year program, or Raj, who started a job in manufacturing right after high school and is now trying to understand what skills he needs to make a career change. So as state leaders across the country are working to improve the quality and availability of pathways from education to employment, they need data that offers them insight into what these transitions look like now and where improvements and investments are needed. And state leaders aren't the only ones who need this data. So people like Grace, Lisa, Joey, and Raj, who are navigating a lot of decisions as they explore their options, deserve clear information to be able to reach their goals. So the good news is most states have a powerful tool that could provide these insights to everyone who needs it. So for many years, states have been investing in building statewide longitudinal data systems that connect individual level data over time from participating state agencies. At a minimum, that includes early childhood, K-12, post-secondary, and workforce. Some states also connect to other agencies like Health and Human Services. Unfortunately, no matter how developed these state systems are, what we hear over and over again from all types of stakeholders in most states is that the data is hard to access. So it can be hard to find, static, and hard to use for decision-making, or out of date. And the reason for this is that many of these systems weren't designed to support data access for so many different audiences, and they're not really meeting today's information needs. So we think states should be reimagining their data systems so they're designed to support access for everyone from students to institutional leaders to governors and the public. That way, rather than being a technology project, the systems can be a service-oriented enterprise and really meet today's information needs. So what might that look like? So we think states should start by thinking about how these systems will be used and by whom, and build out the necessary infrastructure and policies to support those goals. So DQC, with the help of over 40 national partners, has developed a series of use cases that state leaders can use as they're working to redesign their systems to support access. You can find these use cases in our What Now report, which will be circulating via the chat. So these are big changes, but they're possible, and they also require the help of state policy. So we've also developed 10 state policy recommendations that states can follow if they want to get started on this work, that you can also find in our report. Of all of these recommendations, we believe the most important and impactful is for states to codify formal cross-agency governance in law. This means creating a formal process for decision-making about data that's collected in statewide linked systems. So best practice governance policies include a leadership level governing board and an independent office that's responsible for managing the data system. A well-developed data governance law can establish a vision for linked data and make sure that the system is delivering value to people over the long term. There are 9 states across the country that have passed comprehensive data governance laws, and 2 of them are with us today. So Kentucky's been a long-time national leader when it comes to building out a robust data ecosystem that supports data access. The foundation of this has been the state's 2013 law that established a governing board for the Kentucky Longitudinal Data System and a dedicated office to manage the system, which is now called the Kentucky Center for Statistics, or KY Stats. On the other hand, Colorado is the latest state to codify governance. So Governor Jared Polis signed a governance bill into law this summer, which codified the Colorado statewide longitudinal data system governed by a leadership level governing board. The law outlines a clear goal that the system should support access, including for students and families. So we're excited to talk to Matt and Tammy about what their states have done. But now I'd like to turn it to John Furr, who's going to talk about Strada's Clear Outcomes Framework, which is a great place for states to start if they want to improve availability of education to employment data.
Great. Thanks so much, Taryn. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. And as I talk about a state data system framework for clear outcomes work, this really builds on the work that Taryn talked about in terms of creating those under the state policy conditions that are necessary for strong longitudinal data systems. So in terms of who I am, again, I'm John Furr, Chief Data Ecosystem Officer at Strada. Strada is a national foundation that works with partners to strengthen the link between education and opportunity. So within that overall framework of SLDS systems, our focus is really mostly on that post-secondary to employment and workforce related arena. As we think about Strada's work, our work is organized around a North Star to collaborate with stakeholders to bring to life a post-secondary education and training ecosystem that provides equitable pathways to opportunity. And we have 5 overarching pillars, with the clear outcomes work sort of what we're focused on today in relation to the elements and how we think about clear outcomes towards those North Star goals. And as we look to our work, and Strada does significant work with partners focused on the state level, really starts with this key question. How do we know, how can we understand if state education programs are actually leading to life and career opportunities? Well, from Strada's standpoint, and I think with the partners that we have on the line today, we truly believe that this work starts with strong data systems. Again, that's the focus of for data quality campaigns work and kind of building from those strong conditions that they have defined. But as we've worked with post-secondary to employment leaders, we've called out 4 specific functions to help look at the specific elements of state data systems, starting with the collection of key data elements, really getting at this question of if you don't have the right information in the first place, this might seem pretty obvious, but you can't produce insights. This framework is really focused as we think about key post-secondary to employment data components, how that information can be collected and brought into the state longitudinal data systems. As you move from collection, so as the data is brought in, it's critical that the data not be siloed. It can't be siloed within a community college data system or a 4-year data system or the employment, unemployment insurance, wage records. That data has to be brought together, and those linkages need to be created to ensure you have the ability to connect the post-secondary education and training programs to employment opportunity data. That's great and critically important that you have the data brought together within state systems, but it actually has to be provided out to Grace and Raj and Lisa, as Taryn talked about, but also policymakers and other researchers and other third-party stakeholders for the data to have value. And lastly, just beyond provision and access, we believe that data needs to be able to be applied to decisions about the educational investments and options that the individual learners and families are making, but also state policymakers and state systems need to make to really be able to understand what's working well for our learners, where do we need to double down for investments, where do we need to grow programs. And you see at the bottom there, critically important that all this rests on a core foundation of trust, privacy, security, which is foundational to all work that happens within the state data system space. So as we look at that overall framework, Strada has used that framework to assess where states are, not only in the clear outcomes area, but also within the other pillars of Strada's work, which I touched on before. So I know that Rachel just put within the link the State Opportunity Index report, which we published in April of 2024. We plan to publish our second version of that in fall of 2025, and to have this be an annual process to be able to better understand where the US is from an overall standpoint, as well as where each state is across these pillars. And what I'd like to do is to dive in and take the framework I talked about for state data systems and show how this was used in the State Opportunity Index framework for the information that we gathered across states, and also to share how we're thinking about our support network moving forward with states. So as we kind of we'll build out these 10 elements here on the screen that we use that tie to that overall framework. Great. So you see kind of there on the left, there's that collect, integrate, provide impact framework I talked about. And these are the 10 specific elements that we used. And I'll deep dive into each of these components. But we went through a process working with a number of national experts in data systems work, state data system leaders, other stakeholders to define these elements on the front end, work to interview states, to engage in a survey process and research to see where states are in terms of their current progress. And this information is all available again at the State Opportunity Index website, and the link to the specific details for these elements are included in the link that was just put into the chat. Well, let's dive into each of these buckets. So again, started to talk about collection. So there's two elements that we're focused on for the State Opportunity Index framework. One is there's been explosive growth in non-degree, non-credit post-secondary education and training programs. And that is oftentimes a key gap in state data systems, whether or not they're capturing information on those programs, even though those programs are oftentimes serving those who are least well served by traditional degree program options. So we need to understand who is in those programs, what are the outcomes, and that's a core aspect for the collection component. Secondly, when we think about the employment data, actually, if we can go back just really quickly to the collect component, just the second element on collection. For employment data, oftentimes state employment data only provides quarterly wage records, which is helpful and that's important, but we believe that state employment data systems need to have more information on what's the occupation and role that individuals are moving into. How do you understand the pay rate, and how do you understand the work location where workers actually are? And the good news is there's states in both of these areas that have made tremendous progress, and that's highlighted in the State Opportunity Index, but there's a lot more national work to go as well. So going to the next bucket of work, integration is looking at the integration efforts across different aspects. So looking, first of all, foundationally for number 3, to what extent there is integration from post-secondary and training to employment. That's sort of core to this work, but the State Opportunity Index looks not only at public 2- and 4-year systems, to what extent private systems are included within the data integration work, and how well workforce training is included as well. For this fourth element, we know that there is increasingly a blur between high school and college and employment. So states also need to understand that direct connection from high school to employment. And that's something that we assess to look at to make sure that is included, as well as post-secondary employment. And for the fifth area, learners move across state lines. We have a number of areas like where I'm from the Midwest, which is a bi-state geographic location, where we have to have national strategies to think about how do we understand when learners are moving across those state lines and the employment outcomes that are there for those learners as well. So our assessment includes that assessment of states are participating in these multi-state strategies like the Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes Project, Coleridge, and others. So for provide, again, and this really syncs up so well with what Taryn talked about with the DQC use cases. And actually, this is a great resource as you think about the related provide work. Our reflection was saying, how can data be provided out in multiple different formats for multiple audiences? So for this first area around open data files, believing that states there needs to be access to anonymized education to employment statistics that anyone from a website can be able to download and use. And as we think about the AI-infused world we live in, this is critically important. Many learners are going to be going to a chatbot to get information about their post-secondary options, and either that's going to be using Chromie data that's out there that the chatbot takes in, or high quality data that states make available in an open data structure. So it's something that we want to support states in that provision in that direction. Even with open data, though, you still need strong interactive resources that those learners can go to, that their families can go to, that guides like counselors and those who are in nonprofit on-ramp programs can support learners to understand the education to employment outcomes information for different program options. And also, we assess to what extent researchers have access to that data, both researchers within state government and external to state government as well, so they can be able to deliver stronger insights. And last but certainly not least, for the impact framework, there's only two components that we're looking at. So this ninth element is perhaps the most forward-looking element for the framework, but both Kentucky and Colorado are leaning into this to see how do you enable learners to access and utilize their own verified data on their educational credentials, on their employment characteristics that can help them to point them to further opportunities on their college and career path, and that also can unlock credit for some of their prior learning as part of that, or can have employers be able to say that you're a good fit for my job because of that data. That's a role where we think states can play a positive role in supporting that ecosystem. And states need their own capacity to actually be able to dig into the data, to generate insights, to understand how that relates to policy work. So with this overall framework that we have for these 10 elements, you can see on the website we have for each state. Now, this is a real state's data. I didn't want to call them out. It's not the state of Arizona, even though we call it Data Zona. But we can talk for the Data Zona components. What we want is for Data Zona to be able to look at this information and these rating categories that we have and to say, all right, across these 10 elements, I've actually got some core gaps in how I'm integrating data across post-secondary to employment. So how can I be able to use the information and some of the more detailed info to say, this can be a priority for me to sort of learn from other states, like Colorado and Kentucky and various other leaders, as well as to tap into national resources to support that work. And so I encourage all of you, if you're working within a state, go to the appendices, look at the state-specific information that's there, and be able to identify where might there be opportunities within your state to pursue further progress. And last but not least, the last point that I want to make in kind of closing out here is that our work at Strada is not just about providing information out about where states are in terms of these elements. It's working with a broad array of partners to say, how can we support an ecosystem of technical assistance and resources for progress? I worked in the area of state longitudinal data systems for several decades before coming to Strada. This is really hard long-term work, and we need champions like Data Quality Campaign. We're working with the Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes Coalition, a national coalition of state-led leaders, and a number of different resource partners to help plug into states with these efforts. So again, really I know how challenging this work can be, and that's part of what we're trying to do at Strada is to support those states with progress. So thanks very much, Taryn, and I'll turn it back over to you and to our state colleagues.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Very helpful overview. So now we're going to launch into our state panel. I'm excited to welcome Matt Berry and Tammy Heiler to the screen. Get our panel up here. All right. Welcome to you both. We're excited to have you tell us how this is actually done. So Matt, I'd love to begin with you. So you lead KY Stats, and KY Stats and the governing board have been around for over a decade now. So big picture, how is this data ecosystem in Kentucky supporting decision-making to improve the education to employment pipeline in your state?
Well, hey, Taryn, thanks for the question. Thank you to DQC and Strada for having this conversation and for thinking to invite Kentucky. We're happy to be here. And this is a really super important conversation. And you said something about, speaking to how this is done. And that might be overstating it a little bit. I think like one of the things I want folks to know is we are figuring it out as we do it too. Even with sort of more than a decade of history behind us. So I just want to put that out front. So even though I'm probably going to, like a good panelist does, talk as though I really, really know exactly how this is supposed to go, we figure it out as we go. So a little bit, before I kind of directly answer the question about the way that we're using it. I want to take just a very quick step back. I promise it won't be too long, but just a quick step back, talk a little bit about KY Stats and sort of the organization, because it is not truly unique, but it is a little different than maybe some other SLDS systems in the country. So you mentioned very nicely up front that we've been, in our statute, in Kentucky statute since 2013. Some early efforts to build an SLDS were going on a little bit before that. So we've got a little more than a decade of work behind us here in Kentucky. With that kind of time and some success, what that means is our infrastructure has actually become, our data infrastructure has really truly become a cradle to career data infrastructure. Now that can mean a lot of different things, but we really do have early childhood through workforce data, and we connect it and use it. Current day, these are kind of round numbers. We have about 6,000 active data elements from 45 sources and 26 agencies. So that's a lot. But Taryn, you said something in your introduction that I thought was so spot on, because we say it a lot here too, that that stuff's really important, but this is not a technology project. There is absolutely a technology piece to this, and thank goodness we have staff that can take care of that, because if it was up to me, we'd be in real trouble. But that's not sort of like the core purpose of what we're doing. It undergirds what we're doing, right? So with all of the data elements and sources that I just talked about, we pursue what I think about as a public service mission. And we have a mission statement, of course, but really the key part of it to me is we use data to inform so that policymakers, practitioners, and the public at large can make better informed decisions. That guides all of our work. What that makes it look like is we do a lot of public facing work. So on any given year, we'll produce something like 35 to 50 public facing reports. Those are usually pretty big, complex, interactive reports, although they can also be sort of a blog article or a one-off, topical report. We'll do about 500, fulfill somewhere between 350 and 500 data requests, which is a big part of our function. And those can come from all over the country, not just in Kentucky. They can be small, they can be big, easy, complex, but that's a big piece of what we do. And we go out and we actually, because we're good data nerds, we track this stuff. We go out and we do about 750 to 1,000 stakeholder engagements that we can track every year. And that is kind of that last piece there, I think, is the key to answering the actual question you asked me, which seems like a long time ago now. Sorry if I'm rambling. We are connected to as many constituencies, as many stakeholders as we possibly can be, so that we can use our data to inform their conversations. We act sort of as a nonpartisan, we act as a nonpartisan voice that is really focused on using data and research to inform whatever conversations might be had. And so what that allows us to do is take a seat at the table that's really focused on simply using that as a tool. We don't provide recommendations. We don't do policy analyses in terms of if it's going to be a good or negative impact, et cetera. We say this is the workforce participation rate in this geography, and this is what it's looked like over time and for these populations, and that might inform the conversation you're having. So that's kind of where we are. That allows us to be in all kinds of different rooms taking that approach. And so it's been really advantageous, I think, to our partners, but certainly to us in terms of driving what I hope is an impactful set of engagements. And so, I'll just two very quick examples of how that works. Maybe just one, because I think it's a really good example. I sit on what's called the Commonwealth Education Continuum, which is sort of our P20 and statewide initiative. And there is a set of 20 to 25 leaders from across the state who are really looking at the education continuum and how we can work together to improve outcomes for Kentuckians. We obviously are providing the data for that. KY Stats has had a tool for a long time called Life Outcomes Report, which really just looks at a high school graduating class of Kentucky public graduates and looks at their education attainment, employment, and wages over time, I believe it's a 9-year time frame. That was a report that we almost put on the shelf because it wasn't candidly it just wasn't getting a lot of hits. We weren't getting a lot of usage out of it, and it sort of takes a long time. And so we had just had a conversation about not using it or not creating it anymore when this Commonwealth Education Continuum was formed, and they brought that tool up, and it actually informed a massive piece of the early part of the formation of some strategies and work that went into what is now sort of our marching orders for that group. So while that, and now of course we're re-upping it and we're using it as a tool. So for that purpose and for others. So I think that's a good example of being engaged with those groups at the table has informed us for what actually was impactful, but it also, I think, informed the work that they are doing as well.
Thanks, Matt. That's such a great example. And I'm also so glad that you underscored the importance of the independence and nonpartisan nature of your office and why that helps you all be successful in supporting these data tools. And to everyone who's on the webinar as we go, please feel free to submit questions for our panelists, and we'll have some time at the end. So now I'm going to turn to you, Tammy. So we heard before, so Governor Polis signed a governance bill into law this year. So why was establishing governance and codifying a system a priority for him?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you and hello to everyone. Thanks DQC and Strada for having Colorado on this panel as well. And also Matt, just selfishly, it's so wonderful to be on this panel with you. I've already learned something in just the last answer that you gave. And I think it's great to have sort of the newest SLDS system on and sort of the most veteran to hear different perspectives. But I think it's very evident that for all states, KY Stats is really a North Star. So thank you for all of that work and leading the way. But in terms of Colorado and why now, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about Colorado is that we are often seen and uplifted rightfully for being a national leader when it comes to underscoring the importance of education and workforce development. I think especially Governor Polis is laser focused on sort of improving education and workforce outcomes in the state, really willing. Our legislators always been very willing to, try new innovative models, whether that's around skills-based hiring and, all of these important advancements that a lot of states are also working on. But the truth of the matter is that Colorado has, never been able to make the case even faster and harder for the push to expand a lot of these different programs because of the lack of clear data infrastructure and, us not having an SLDS system in the state. And, I don't think that's for a lack of trying. I joined this team about 2.5 years ago. And, I actually remember coming in and as the education advisor being like, what are the efforts happening around SLDS? And people literally told me 2.5 years ago, it would be impossible to get an SLDS system in Colorado. We've tried, there's too many politics, there's too many, it's just, we know it's important, but we've figured out all these little workarounds and other data sharing agreements and between interagencies that, were allowing us to kind of cobble data together as we go. But it's just not going to happen. But it was interesting because while I was hearing that one narrative from folks who have, rightfully tried and, were unsuccessful in the past, what we were also seeing in the state were just sort of these task force reports that were coming out that were being put forward by business leaders, by our K-12 sector, by our higher education institutions. All of these stakeholders and voices in these reports were calling for an SLDS system and were providing a lot of very clear reasons why we needed to be able to have a better data infrastructure. I mean, truly, like we were unable to very quickly or timely answer very, very basic questions about, all of these post-secondary and workforce readiness programs that we're investing in at the high school level. We have no way of really knowing what the outcomes of those are. And so I think in particular, there was one task force that was very well respected and well represented by all of those different stakeholders that I mentioned that put out a report that was essentially saying, this is our #1 priority. We cannot advance this work without the data infrastructure. And so I think that we got, it was like, well, let's try again. Like, we know people are saying this, let's try, this is the time. And I will say I was pleasantly surprised at how easy it was actually for us to make the case this last year. And I want to give a lot of credit to DQC in particular, who I know helped Colorado and allowed us to see the perspective, learn from what other states were doing to actually be able to put something forward. And so we were able to pass this with wide bipartisan support in the legislature. And I think, a lot of that is in part because of this focus on governance, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. But I think, in general, just like Matt laid out, the goals for our SLDS system are twofold. Number one is for us to actually be able to answer very basic questions about the outcomes and investments that we're making in education and workforce. And of course, making sure that that data and information is, publicly available to the people whose lives are going to be impacted by the decisions and programs that they want to actually attend. And I think another part of this is also this idea of just better efficiency within state government and understanding that having a ton of different data sharing agreements between a bunch of agencies and not really knowing where there was duplication, where there was a lot of time and effort and FTE and money sort of being put into these one-off reports, which in many cases were providing data that was already 5 years outdated based on the nature of the way these agreements were in place, was also to just create better efficiencies. And so we're really excited. Our SLDS work is just getting off the ground, and our governance board and those conversations are literally just starting. So really excited to hopefully, we can report back in a year or two of all of the sort of short-term and longer-term successes that we're able to see from getting this up and running.
Thanks, Tammy. It's also exciting. And I also think it's good to underscore the importance of just a leadership champion for this work, that is what it takes to kind of have that vision to move this along. So exciting to hear about that in Colorado. So that's a great segue. Let's talk about governing boards. So Matt, I would love to hear you talk about kind of the connection between, why does having a codified governing board in law, why does that help you provide access to data in Kentucky? And if you could also talk about in your answer how both education and workforce perspectives are represented on the board.
Sure. So I would say the way that our governing board is structured has been one of the most critical factors to our sustainability and to our success. And if my board members ask, you can tell them I said that. But our board, and let me tell you, I guess I should kind of describe the way that we are structured. And this was in that originating statute. So our board is comprised of the Secretary of the Education and Labor Cabinet, the Commissioner of the Kentucky Department of Education, the President of the Council on Post-Secondary Education, the Secretary of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, and the CEO of the Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority, which is they do more, but it's basically our financial aid arm in the state. So that is how our board is comprised. So just sort of by definition, we've got education and workforce represented, at least to some degree, right? I don't think anyone would say that we have a full representation of either, but we at least have those voices in that area and that expertise represented on the board and in the room driving critical conversations. Now, so taking one step down, sort of past that top level, I will say that we have developed a lot of our strategies and operational principles through committee because boy, do we love a good committee, right? And so and even a subcommittee occasionally if we really want to go crazy. So the representation from education and workforce, that has traditionally been expanded through the use of committees. So one sort of tangible example that comes up every 3 years, we're guided by a 3-year research agenda. So right now, our current research agenda will expire at the end of 2025. That was developed in coordination with a committee of probably 15 to 20 folks, certainly representatives of the agencies and organizations that sit on our board, but also others outside of state government and outside of those agencies. So that is another way that we kind of get representation sort of through our governing structure, but also outside of it. That's been really helpful for us. I mentioned right at the beginning, because I often am asked kind of, what would you suggest or what are tips? And I think that establishing a cross-sector governing board right up front is really, really critical. or at very least it has been for us. And Taryn, you kind of highlighted what I was discussing earlier about our independence and nonpartisan status. That has been one of the ways in which that has really been solidified into the culture of the way we work and the way that others, I think, perceive us as an agency and as a partner. That's been huge. I think that after 10 plus years, just to use an example, our legislature understands that when they ask us to come and present, they're getting a certain presentation, right? They're getting the data related to the questions that they have. They're getting maybe some research related to that, but they are not getting me telling them what I think about why something happened or what they should do about it. That is not going to happen. And part of the reason I think I'm able to do that is because we have such a clear governance structure. I am sort of a little bit removed from internal workings and turnover, et cetera. But also what that allows to Tammy, I thought you made a really great point in terms of efficiency. It has allowed for some efficiency. It certainly created efficiency in the early years, because in creating that governance structure, we also mandated certain levels of data sharing amongst those agencies with the longitudinal data system. And so now, right up front, we've created sort of a mandated set of sharing behaviors and agreements. And we were able to build off of that. We didn't have to start from, okay, should we start with K-12, get them on board, and then go to higher ed? Or, well, maybe we should go to unemployment so we can get, we didn't have to start from there, right? We kind of, we were able to do that from the beginning and start with a really strong foundation. I think today people still probably primarily think education to workforce data with us, and that's great. We've expanded well beyond that, and I think we continue to consider how we can expand beyond that. And I'll be honest with you, we even have questions around, should we think about expanding the governing board, right? Would that be another helpful step? Now, we have not taken, I just want to be really clear, we've not taken any action towards that. It's just conversations. But the reason we're having those conversations, I think, is because of the points I'm bringing up, which is that has been a real key hallmark of how we've operated, why we've been successful. So if we're interested in other sectors being represented in our system, could we have them represented on our board as well? So, I can go on and on about the way that that's really influenced our long-term, success and sustainability, but I really do think it's an absolutely critical factor and has been for us.
Great, thanks, Matt. So, Tammy, I'd love to turn to you, and I'd love to kind of get into why a law, right? Some states have done this through executive order or some other mechanism. So why was it important to codify a governing board in law? And then could you talk about the process of engaging stakeholders kind of along the way as you develop the legislation?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, in part, I mentioned that there had been sort of a long history in SLDS attempts not, being successful in Colorado. And I think there were, multiple reasons for why that was the case. But one of the ones that kept coming up was that it was never clear who was going to be the entity, right? Which entity or agency in the state would be the entity that would actually be in charge and sort of host this SLDS. And, it sounds like Kentucky, you navigated that in a really important, impactful way by having this kind of standalone unit. And I think that was something that was really important to us, was identifying who that could be, because there had been in the past, and I understand why, there's mistrust. If our Department of Education would be the agency holding the SLDS system, then, it's a little strange when you have your Department of Higher Education that has to go through a separate agency, which in Colorado has a different governance structure and oversight than, their agency, and et cetera. And so we were able to identify and work with our Office of Information Technology to serve as that neutral agency or entity to host this work. So I think it was really important that we identified that and made sure that we were putting that into statute so that there was never confusion or the ability for that, to change hands or to feel like there's other politics at play there. And then in terms of having a codified governance structure in statute, I think we did a lot of research, talked to a lot of states, like I mentioned, worked with DQC on lessons learned, and sort of learned very quickly that it was really important to put in statute who actually should be at the table and representing each of those agencies to ensure that there is effective buy-in. So we made sure that in our governance structure, the way that we have it set up is that we have a, sort of our main governance panel voting members are represented by either the agency's executive director or a senior leader that is appointed by that executive director to ensure that there is agency buy-in from the top, that this is something that they're committed to working on. Then we also built in sort of these two sub non-voting governance structures. And so one of them is made up of, the way I think about it, it's like the technical experts at every agency that knows all the data codes and, has been working in these systems for many years. And then the other is more of the like programmatic folks. So these are the people at agencies who are going to be having conversations about like, hey, we can't answer this question about, whether or not students attending a school with a 4-day school week end up going on and, matriculating, or what their long-term outcomes are. Like they're the ones having more of those types of conversations to then feed up to the main governance body to be able to say, okay, these are the things that we need to prioritize and vote on and, commit to as a state for the reports that we're going to run. And so, yeah, I think it was making sure that we had the leadership and buy-in that we needed to, and putting that in statute. And then also we had learned in many of our conversations about just the importance of that type of transparency as well. By putting something in statute, it also is ensuring that like we are making sure that the public, that students, that institutions, et cetera, all these parties that are going to have data involved know that this is going to happen in a transparent manner that's going to, take into account data privacy in a really important way, and hopefully build the type of trust that, Matt, you've talked about does exist in Kentucky. I mean, I think that's ultimately our goal. And, I'm sure there will be iterations along the way. And I also should have mentioned, because this is new, we also wanted to sort of start very intentionally with having our SLDS be just education and workforce right now. So it includes all of our agencies from our Department of Early Childhood up to our Department of Labor Employment, with the hopes that if we can prove this model and show, legislators and the public that this is really, a value add to the state, that ultimately over time we can start integrating other agencies as well. But we wanted to be very intentional about that. And just kind of getting back to the stakeholder question in general. I mean, I mentioned before, when we were, putting this system in place, we were really talking to the business community, the K-12 community, higher education, students, parents. And then it was very helpful that we were able, in other state convened task forces that were talking about, just the need for better data, seem to all kind of come to the same conclusion that our data infrastructure in Colorado is lagging behind other states and where we need to be, which is a huge contrast because we're often lifted up as sort of a leader in this space. And so I think, Matt, you may have mentioned even higher stakeholder engagement as well. And I think we probably need to, I think it's an important reminder to us that like, just because we did stakeholder engagement to get us to the place of allowing us to have the SLDS, like that is not over, and actually making sure we continue to have stakeholder engagement and buy-in, and people feel like they have transparency, know when these meetings are, feel like they have ways to actually engage, is going to be something that our SLDS governance board is going to have to consider and keep top of mind as we continue to grow this, and if we want to be able to be successful long term.
Thanks. I love that idea of stakeholder engagement just being part of how you do business, rather than kind of like a one-time process. So thanks for that. So let's turn to my last round of questions, and then we'll try to get to some audience questions. So I wanted to bring it back to the Strada Clear Outcomes framework that John reviewed earlier, and kind of connect that to the work you all are doing. So Matt, I'll start with you. So when you look at the elements that are in Strada's Clear Outcomes framework, how do you think of them, being incorporated into any future, improvement work that you're doing in Kentucky?
Yeah, so I genuinely do love the framework, and actually, John, I love the way that you talked about it. It's such a helpful way to sort of describe what it's for. But I was sort of making a joke up front about we're just trying to figure it out at KY Stats, even being a decade in. But I mean, that is actually really true. I mean, we this is to some degree, at least, this is still really an emerging field, at least in practice. And so, to me, one of the things, I think there are several benefits to the framework. For us, even as a mature organization or maturing organization in SLDS, it can help to identify, or as for me at least, help to identify some of the factors that go into a really robust system. And it's really nice to have that codified, laid out. And sometimes that can be really sort of affirming, because you think, okay, well, that's exactly what we're focused on. And then sometimes it can sort of be like a bit of a light bulb because we haven't talked about that in 3 years, kind of a thing, right? And so we better get on it, because maybe we have something of that nature, but we don't pay a lot of attention to it. So I think that's really helpful. It's helpful as in terms of organizing, what might matter. I also really think it can help in prioritization, right? So I guess that's sort of tangential to organization. The last piece that I really love, and so I'm a former athlete, so I have a healthy dose of competitiveness, but it kind of can show you where you are. And so Kentucky, we are really fortunate to have this great system, but internally we don't talk about how great we are. We talk about what's next and what we want to be doing, and who else is coming and who else is doing a great job, and how do we partner with them, but how do we also continue to do better, right? So I know that the tool is not designed to, drive competition between states, at least not expressly, but I do think that can be a benefit to that. And really specifically why that matters, except for just getting me excited because nobody cares about that can really drive engagement amongst key stakeholders and decision makers for new efforts. And so, John talked about, I think it's number 9 under the impact piece of the framework, and that we are starting to, and it's about empowering data owner individuals to own and use their own data. When you see kind of where other states are engaged in that or not, and where they are, and it is a new and emerging body of work, I think, across the country. It can be really helpful to have that kind of information and say, hey, look, this state is really leaned into this. And I know we've had a lot of discussions, but maybe it's time to start moving, or move beyond the discussion phase. So I think it can be really helpful in galvanizing some action and really kind of pushing the ball forward. At least that's how I've tried to start using it.
Great. Well, Tammy, Governor Polis is the chair of the National Governors Association right now, and he's announced that he plans to use that platform to prioritize education and workforce improvements. So I was curious if you could tell us what role data will play in that initiative and what alignment you see between his education and workforce data priorities and the elements in Strada's framework.
Yeah, thank you for giving me a moment to be able to elevate this work, because it is extremely aligned to, I think, all of the goals in the conversation that we're all working towards on this call. Very quickly, though, I will also just echo what Matt said in terms of like how states can use this opportunity index. And I'm a former teacher in which it was always like, hey, if someone else has a good lesson that they're doing in their class, use it, right? And I feel I've been pleasantly surprised in the role that I'm in the governor's office that there's also a very similar sense among states that hey, if some other state has figured something out that is working really well and there's a way to identify that quickly, then go for it, learn from them. And so I just want to echo that I think this is an incredibly useful tool to be, for governor's offices in other states to be able to quickly identify who those people are that we need to be talking to. In terms of the governor's initiative, so yes, Governor Polis became the chair of the National Governors Association this July, which means that he has an entire year to uplift one initiative in which he's able to elevate a national conversation on a topic. It's not surprising to anybody that Governor Polis would have selected education as his primary focus. And what he's leading is an effort called Let's Get Ready, Educating All Americans for Success. And really what his goal is through this initiative is to have a conversation about how are we actually measuring outcomes when it comes to our education system. And specifically thinking about from a governor's perspective, education is typically the single largest expenditure in a state's budget, anywhere from 25 to 30%. And governors should feel equipped to be able to, understand and answer how well those systems are sort of doing two things. One is from an individual learner's perspective, are individual students that are going through your education system ultimately getting whatever knowledge and skills they need to go on and live successful lives, but then also thinking about education systems from an economic competitiveness perspective, right? Like, is our education system actually driving economic competitiveness within our state in terms of being able to connect students to whatever industry or skills that they need to, once again, go on and live successful lives. And so, clearly, if we're having a conversation about measures and outcomes, the crux of that is making sure that states have the data infrastructures that they need to be able to answer those questions. And I think especially some of the work that Strada is doing and what they have laid out through the way that they've been able to measure data through the Opportunity Index is an incredible model for the type of framework that states can be applying, not only thinking about the success of their post-secondary education systems, but in the governor's mind, also thinking about how do we start having more of those intentional conversations, even at the K-12 level. So the example, that the governor talks a lot about is that, nobody is underscoring, and we're not trying to say that math and reading and having a high school diploma do not matter. Of course, those are critically important, and we need to understand those outcomes. But it's also that I don't think anybody today can say that a student getting a high school diploma alone is enough for them to ultimately go on to meet their highest potential in today's economy. And so I think that one of the things that we would love to be able to continue to elevate through this initiative is thinking about what is a new innovative measure or way that we can think about education success beyond just the high school diploma. And I say this example a lot if someone's heard me talk about the initiative already, but it's been really interesting for me to learn that it was actually back in 2005 through an NGA initiative that it was governors that came together and essentially created the adjusted cohort graduation rate. Before then, states were using different yardsticks, measurements of like what even a high school graduate was and how they were measuring that. And it was governors that came together and said, that's not particularly helpful. Like, we are all aligned in needing to have a better yardstick. And ultimately, the federal government a couple of years later went on to sort of adopt that model. So I think, in our dream world, we'd be able to sort of push along a conversation that is similar to that. And also thinking about even earlier in the education pipeline, right? Having more national unified conversations about what does kindergarten readiness mean? What does it look like at 8th grade, 9th grade? What are some of those indicators and metrics that we need to be looking at? So encourage many of you on this call, if you haven't been engaged, we're looking forward over the next year to elevate these conversations through a series of national convenings. We'll be posting things on the NGA website. And then next July, we'll hopefully have a roadmap that we can provide to states specifically that will cover a lot of the learnings and also think about sort of I'm thinking of it more of like an implementation or how-to guide of how can states actually put in place the infrastructure that they need to be able to measure the outcomes that matter and find ways to scale the things that they identify that are working, and maybe even sometimes have those hard conversations about how do states kind of roll back the things that they see are not actually in service of those outcomes. So that's where we are. And thank you for giving me a minute to elevate that, because I do think it's so critically important to the work that's already happening in many states.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so exciting. Thanks for sharing that, Tammy. So now we've got about 5 minutes left. We have time for one or two audience questions. And maybe if we want to bring John back on the screen in case there's a question for him. But Matt, I wanted to start with you because we have quite a few questions that were submitted about the stakeholder engagement efforts that you referenced. So I was wondering if you could speak to how long did it take to kind of ramp up to that level of engagement, or was that just always how you did things? And then if you could give like one or two specific examples of how you engage stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it has been a part of the way that we've worked from the very, very beginning. I remember, so Kate Akers, who is now at DQC and was the executive director two before me and is a good friend of mine. I was working at the Council on Post-Secondary Education at this point. I remember in 2014, Kate being in an ungodly number of meetings with like a front and back PDF of what is now our high school feedback report. And she would go into any room that would have her and tell people about this. And I remember thinking like, this is magic that I don't understand and I don't think it's going to work. So here I am, right? So she was right and I was wrong as always. But, kidding aside, to her credit, I think, and not just her, others that were around at that time, that was such a critical piece of the early days of what has become KY Stats, not only in terms of showing folks what the early products were, but also in terms of getting early support for the idea of the organization and of the statute, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always been baked into our DNA. That has grown over time as our capacity and staff has grown, but it is really a part of how we do business. And so I'll give you an example that's happening right now. We have a report that we call Students' Right to Know, which was actually legislatively required of us. And, without going into it, it basically is a report which is designed to give students as much information about their post-secondary choices as possible. We as sometimes is the case, did not know that was going to come through statute. And so we put together that report as well and as fast as we could. I think we did a great job of creating something and also knew that it should and could be better. And so we spent probably 6 to 8 months working with our colleagues at the Department of Education and the Council on Post-Secondary Education to go out and hold focus groups with students, parents, counselors, faculty, et cetera, to basically ask them, what should we be doing better? And we partnered with the University of Kentucky to help us really do a very robust analysis of the findings that we had in that. And we just finished creating version 2.0 of that. And we have started to unveil it. It's publicly available, but we really started to engage with stakeholders on it and are getting some really wonderful feedback from educational partners. So I think, and I will say, I don't think we're done. I think we've got to have a mobile only version of that. That's another area we're going to go into, I think, with that. And so we will keep doing that kind of engagement to get better. So it's always been a part of what we do. It's certainly grown over time, and it's a really key thing that I think leads to better reports.
Well, we are almost out of time. I'm going to see if we can answer this last question really quickly. And anyone can take it. So the question is, are any of you able to measure what company a student works at after their program? For example, if a student completes an HVAC certificate at a community college and what their job title is. I'm interested to see if you found a way because it's going to be helpful for institutions.
Darren, I would love to jump on that. And so,
Go
yes,
ahead.
that is one of the elements as we talk about enhancing employment wage records, adding the occupational field within that allows you to get exactly at that question, to understand if you train the individual for a particular job role, or are they in that job role? Or maybe for liberal arts programs, do you have a number of people going into project management roles and functions? And maybe you can actually strengthen your programs by layering in some credentials that relate to those roles, the jobs people are starting to move into. But there's about 10 states nationally that are either have mandatory or voluntary adoption of occupational requirements for their wage records. And we very much want to be able to support other states that are moving down that path because it gets at some really critical questions when you're talking about posting to employment outcomes that you can't get at scale without those types of enhancements.
So helpful. So go check out Strada's report for more information on that. And I guess we'll end there. I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. This has been a really great conversation. And let me go ahead and I'm going to share our contact information. If anybody had questions that weren't answered today, that they would like to reach out to any of us, please feel free to do that. We really appreciate everyone joining. Hope you go improve those data systems.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
bye, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, everybody.
Bye.